Hello and welcome to Perspectives. Now tonight the spotlight is on nuclear energy. On March 11th last year, a massive earthquake caused a tsunami that struck the coast of Japan. This eventually led to what's now known as the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster, a series of meltdowns and failures that not only shocked the world, it also made people across the planet think twice about nuclear power generation. Now, can Asia afford to ignore nuclear power? In a post-Fukushima world, where do you stand on nuclear energy? Joining me this evening are Professor Arnold de Meyer, President of Singapore Management University, Assistant Professor Gopi Rathanaraj from the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, Mr. Remy Ottobert, Senior Executive Vice President for Asia at Areva, a nuclear power generation company, and Dr. Elspeth Thompson, Senior Fellow at the Energy Studies Institute. Now, welcome to all of you. Remy, let's start with you. You were in Japan when the tsunami struck.
Indeed.
Having stayed there then and watched how the Japanese public reacted, what impact do you think Fukushima has had on the public perception in Japan on nuclear energy?
Yes, Deborah, obviously it's been a strong impact. And as you said, I was there. I witnessed the initial devastating earthquake, tsunami. And then within the Fukushima crisis, I was in charge of trying to help the TEPCO company to mitigate the effects of the crisis. So I certainly was with the Japanese people, and I can really understand their feeling and the deep concern that they have had during this crisis. So it is certainly something which will take time to heal. There is a big need to make changes so that this perception and this big shock that they had with this crisis will progressively disappear, and they can understand, how it can be improved and not happen again in the future.
How much time is needed before they're going to believe in nuclear power again? Are they going to be told, now there, everything's going to be fine?
No, I don't think they will just believe by saying. I think they will believe by actions. And of course, there is need for a lot of actions. A lot of actions have been taken, of course, in Japan, but as you know, all over the world, to make sure that this kind of event will not happen. And in fact, it is not that difficult, really, because it certainly is an event which was triggered by a natural disaster, which was this tsunami. Not really the earthquake by itself, because the earthquake really did not damage the reactors. There were reactors next to this one, which were not hit by the tsunami, which were closer to the epicenter in Onagawa, and which were not affected by the earthquake. But the tsunami did. So this was a big event, but what things could have been done, obviously, to avoid that this event would create a catastrophe. And that's why, it has been said that it is a man-made catastrophe, because the catastrophe was because of things which were not, action which were not taken on time. And of course, this action can be taken and will be taken for all the reactors in the world.
Sorry, Professor.
I would like to react to that in the sense that one has also to take a little bit of a long-term perspective, Deborah. This is not the first accident that has happened with a nuclear reactor, and the two major ones before were 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl.
Yeah.
And in those two cases, there were a few short-term reactions, as we have seen today in Japan, where a number of reactors were closed, and in Germany, where they were closed. But the mid-term to long-term impact had very little to do with the accidents. Before 3 Mile Island, the United States had already decided to reduce significantly its construction of nuclear reactors. And after Chernobyl, not a lot changed. I do fully agree with Remy that the impact for the Japanese population, and for many people, is a strong impact. But I would also argue that the real impact will come from economic numbers. Is nuclear energy still economically viable in comparison to other things? So, yes, accidents like this are dramatic. We feel a lot of sympathy with the people that lived in it, but I do think that in the long term, the position of nuclear energy will be less determined by these accidents than by a purely cold economic analysis whether
But
it makes sense.
there's risks on a day-to-day basis. As
Everywhere
we speak
risks.
here,
Everywhere risks.
there are wastes that are being transported long distances, and they're supposedly being captured in places which are secure. Do you guys plan to be around in 500 years or 10,000 years and see if that radioactivity is gone? We don't know. We
But
don't know.
that's a similar problem with global warming. We are not going to be around in 500 years to see how much the carbon-based energy has damaged our environment.
We should have another
We are
debate.
all working with lots of risks. I agree with you. We need to try to reduce the impact of that risk.
Okay, let's try to talk about the impact not only in Japan but on the rest of Asia, right? I mean, Vietnam has announced that it will go ahead to build its nuclear power plant by 2014. It could be a response to the economic needs. But do you think that the public in the rest of Asia, Southeast Asia, for instance, is ready to accept that we need nuclear energy as part of the mix? Gopi.
Well, Fukushima has posed a very unusual challenge in the 21st century because, if I remember correctly, this is the first nuclear accident to happen at a time of 24-by-hour television and in an era of explosion of information through the internet. So this is going to keep the memories of Fukushima much longer than the memories of 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl, which got eventually faded away from public memory. So this is going to pose a major challenge in my view.
But there's a tremendous education gap that has to be filled. You know, following Fukushima, the Chinese citizens were running to the stores to buy salt. They thought that the iodine in the salt would help them. Picture, if you will, deepest, darkest Asia or deepest, darkest Africa. Can you really see a network of nuclear power plants serving these people? You know, picture, you know, open sewers, cooking on an open flame, illiterate people, people who have no control over their fertility. Is it fair to think that nuclear power is going to solve all of their problems? Surely they need power now. There's
Is it fair to leave them in the dark?
But there's other alternatives.
But
They're not good.
Elspeth, I think that the issue is not really to just have nuclear. Obviously, there will be, you know, whatever happens in Asia, because of the enormous needs which we see, the growth of power needs, the growth of energy needs in general. A lot of that will still be filled by fossil fuel. So of course, nuclear is not going to replace everything. The question is, how much of nuclear do we have?
Let me go back to one point which you raised just now. Would you talk about what happened in Fukushima, and the failure was a man-made failure, that it was about whether or not it was too cozy a relationship between TEPCO and regulator and government. But you seem to imply that it's not about the technology, but it was human failing, systemic failing.
What I'm saying, Deborah, is that the impact, of course, the tsunami could not have been avoided.
Yes.
But the impact and the effect and the release of radiation into the environment, which is the important point here. As you know, there has been no casualty, but a lot of release of radioactivity, which means that there's been evacuation. So this could have been avoided with a number of measures, which are, of course, technology measures or risk management measures, you know, making sure that, for instance, no release will happen, no hydrogen explosion will happen. These are type of things which can be done and which are done in the new types of reactors, in the Generation 3 reactors, which are the safest ones, the ones which are going to be built in the future. And in those reactors, so these consequences would not have happened. There would still have been a big issue. The reactors would have suffered, certainly, but not with an effect on population, which is what we don't want. Okay, and I think that can be achieved with a number of rules. So that's one lesson, of course, from Fukushima, increasing the standards of safety and taking the appropriate actions. Now, other, of course, lessons have been learned in terms of governance, for instance. There is clearly an issue about the safety authority governance. How do they work? How do they work with the operator? What kind of independence do they have? There are issues about transparencies.
Yes.
This is also very important to develop. Yes. So there are a lot of things which need to be improved. A lot of it had been done after the prior events, but still we see that more needs to be done. And it is only with those improvements that this public perception, in Asia and everywhere will be improved.
Okay.
I can only reinforce that because we shouldn't talk as if we have a choice. I mean, there are 435 nuclear reactors in the world. There are 64 of them under construction. And of the 64, many of them are in China, 26, 10 in Russia, and 6 in India. I mean, the reality is we live in a world where there are nuclear power plants. So the question is really what Remy was indicating, that is, how can we reduce the risk that is related to these power plants? And also, how do we make sure, and there I agree with Elsbeth, that is, how do we provide much more education? Because I fear the example that you have given about the Chinese is radiophobia. It is sort of anything that has to do with nuclear reminds us immediately of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and atomic bombs. Well, the reality is that in 3 Mile Island, nobody died. In the case of Chernobyl, it was less than 100 people. And in the case of Japan, until now, nobody died. So the risks were kept under control. Are they heavy? Yes, I agree. We need to work hard on it. But let's not exaggerate.
Okay, my point about the situation in Japan is that, picking up Elsbeth's point again, is that if we're going to introduce nuclear energy to countries where perhaps governance is not the best, surely we have an issue to worry about, because it could happen in Japan. It could happen anywhere else.
Japan was very proud of its nuclear power program. And now look at it. It's a mess. Why should we tempt fate when there are alternatives? The world is awash with gas right now.
Yeah.
There's coal, which is dirty, I understand, but we have supercritical plants which capture quite a bit of that carbon. We are looking after the sulfur. We're looking after the nitrogen oxides. We do not have to rely on nuclear. And actually, nuclear power plants are just making a dent in terms of global warming. China's nuclear power, in terms of its electricity generation mix now, is less than 2%. By 2020, it'll be 5–6%. In India, by 2040, maybe 9%. We are in a fossil fuel world, like it or not.
All right, let's pick this up.
I don't like it.
we have to go for a short break. Can we afford to ignore the need for nuclear? Stay with us. Thank you for staying with us on Perspectives. Now, just before the break, we were talking about, can we afford to ignore nuclear? Gopi, what do you think?
Well, the question is, do we have any other sources to combat global warming and environmental pollution? In the very long run, we are left with renewables and nuclear, and very likely renewables is not going to solve our energy problem. So that indicates that nuclear definitely has a role to play. The question is what percentage? That is an economic question. That's going to be a social question. I would be extremely uncomfortable if 100 or 150 countries build nuclear power plants. My take on this is nuclear power is certainly acceptable in countries which are large enough to deal with their wastes and which are large enough to develop the necessary industrial infrastructure and human resources to take care of the nuclear legacy. I'd be extremely uncomfortable if institutional gaps in human resources and industrial infrastructure are wanting in countries. So if you look at these criteria, there are quite a few countries, and most of these countries happen to be populous countries in the world, which would need enormous amount of energy in the coming years.
You provided us a map earlier. If you can call it up, maybe you'd like to explain your map to us, which had all these red spots indicating the number of plants around the world. The map is on over there. If you can just...
So you can see that the red spot, or the pink one, they are the operating nuclear power plants in the world. And the green and the red spots indicate the regions around the world which are seismically vulnerable. So you can see that most of the nuclear reactors are sited in safe locations, seismically stable locations. And you can also see that it's only the Japanese who have been sticking the reactors in the wrong place. But Japan doesn't have much choice given their own land constraints. The Japanese decided to emphasize on engineering innovation by putting more emphasis on engineered safeguards rather than looking at geological stability and natural convenience.
So do you think that they have sufficient engineering safeguards in place?
Well, until now the experience suggests that engineering safeguards had taken care of the major earthquakes. but certainly it has not prepared them for the
Human.
9 event and the tsunami that
Yes.
they have experienced in 2011. But I can also add one more point. We cannot escape saying that, the Japanese cannot escape saying that this is a very rare event. If you look at the historical events in the last 400 or 500 years, at least every century the Japanese have had an event of 8
Tsunami
or more, and
or,
also
yeah,
tsunami.
earthquake,
So
yeah.
if they had looked their own history, they should have taken sufficient caution. But they didn't, and in fact their own diet report had acknowledged the failure of humans and human institutions. So this is certainly one lesson to be learned from Fukushima. The other important lesson is going back to fundamentals. One of the first things that nuclear operators do in a siting assessment is to look at the geological suitability of sites. So now this is going to be even more important. In fact, this should be the most important criteria that nuclear operators will have to look in the post-Fukushima era.
Remy, what do you think? Because you seem to suggest that, you know, the engineering is safe, there are enough safeguards in place, people can be trained.
Yeah, I think it can be solved, it can be trained. Of course, you have to be careful about the seismic issues, and certainly you want to take the appropriate measures not to increase the risk, actually to reduce and to mitigate. And there are solutions in terms of siting, and there are solutions in terms, of course, of safety measures, as I explained. I'd like to come back to Elspeth's position about, saying, in Asia, of course, we could do without nuclear. And I think there is no question that, you can find sources. Technically, of course, you can burn coal, or even more, you can burn oil and you can burn gas. But what kind of society does this continent want in the future? There are issues. Do they want the economic effects that it will imply in terms of cost of electricity, in terms of unpredictability of the cost of electricity in the future? And do we want a continent where the CO2 emissions will grow tremendously? The air quality in China situation. There are a lot of challenges with air quality in China because of the coal burning.
Yes.
And this is something that has to be taken into consideration. And then there is also the question of independence about the energy sources. One of the reasons for Japan to go nuclear was, like France, by the way, same reason, was because we had no resources. Japan, like France, has no oil, no gas, no coal. So what do? Do you want to depend only on Middle East countries to provide you with your stuff at any price in the future? It is not a possible scheme. So you have somehow to compromise and find a good balance, which will include, of course, renewable. That's, of course, obviously a very good choice, and it has to be pushed, but also nuclear. And then there will remain a lot of fossil, too much probably, but there will remain a lot of fossil.
The question,
I really think that we have no choice. First of all, because I'm realistic and down to earth enough to realize that nuclear energy is there. It's not like
It's already
as
here,
if we
right.
can decide not to do it anymore. And it is rather...
The Germans
But
are
you can
deciding
decide.
not to use
But
it.
it's rather stupid, I was just going to say, to close down a running plant because your problems remain exactly the same. You still have the waste and you still have to decommission the plant. You can as well use that plant as well as possible. So the first point that I want to make is, let's not be irrealistic. It's there.
Okay.
And some will be closed, and some in Japan definitely, and some will be decommissioned, etc. But if you look in the on the long run, it probably will be the 22nd century before we close the last plant that currently is in
operating.
operation or in planning.
Okay,
So let's work with that. But secondly, I would like to say is it's part of the energy mix. I'm very much in favor of alternative and renewables. But the reality is that in some countries it's going to work, in other countries it doesn't work. If you want to have sun-based energy in the United Kingdom, you need to probably cover Wales with
Too much cloud cover in the UK, you'll never get enough sun
you
there.
need to cover the whole of Wales with solar cells
panels.
so that you can get energy. It is not going to work. In some countries we have no choice if we want to look at base energy to go for nuclear energy. the wind energy and sun energy are very intermittent. You probably have to install about 5 times the capacity that you really need to be able to cover the needs. So electricity based on nuclear energy today is about 13.5% of the world's production. It probably will be reduced. It probably will go to 10%.
I can think of something that would close the
but it's
nuclear
only
power
3% renewables for the moment, with 15% with an equally installed capacity. Renewables are horribly expensive.
Well,
let me say...
I would just agree on this point of baseload capacity. If you look at the convenience of nuclear in running baseload, it's difficult to match with any other resource except for hydro. So I could see a future where much of the baseload is provided by coal and nuclear and hydro, and the rest being picked on by gas, because we don't know whether gas prices will stay low far into the future. So gas...
They will with the shale oil, right?
And then renewable, again, the costs have to come down in order to make sense. Again, we have to install 4 to 5 times the capacity in order to meet the availability of a typical nuclear plant or a hydropower plant.
But isn't it always a trade-off? I mean, with hydroelectric power, I mean, we've seen so much opposition in Asia as well, the Bakun Dam, the dams which were built in Laos and Myanmar as well.
Yeah, there's
so
plenty of problems.
Can we afford? Yes.
No
Really
source of power, no source of industrial as it is perfect, unfortunately. Otherwise, we would all be doing it, So you have other economical issues, you have technical issues, you have risk issues. So I think the question is compromising.
But in the case of nuclear power, if somebody lobbed a bomb at a nuclear power plant, you'd have a big problem. Whereas you'd have a big boom if it was at a coal plant, a gas plant, or a hydropower plant. You'd have a big boom, and the cloud would dissipate and eventually go, and people would get on with their lives. Is this true about nuclear?
No, I would disagree, because it's difficult to imagine a nuclear power plant blowing up like a nuclear bomb. Because
9/11 type thing?
No, it's difficult, because the material that is there in the nuclear reactor is very low enriched uranium, and so there's no way you can physically convert it like a nuclear weapon. So what you will see in the case of a
I'm talking about leakage of radioactivity, though.
Still, it's difficult to penetrate the containment shell. You have to hit it with a nuclear weapon in order to cause substantial damage.
It's much easier to bomb a petrochemical processing plant and create heavy damage with chemicals rather than with nuclear power. Those are much more... And actually, there was in Chiba a plant that went on fire, and nobody spoke about it, but probably more people suffered from the chemical intoxication than from the radiation.
Yeah, you can kill more people by bombing you can kill more people by bombing a petrochemical complex or even an oil tanker or a LNG facility.
But the long term,
let's not give
terrorists, right?
Let's not give terrorists too many ideas today.
So, Deborah, you have to realize that, of course, again, the experiences from the past have been taken into consideration. The reactors which are now proposed, what we call Generation 3 reactors, which are the latest reactors. Right. Of course, in the case of my company, we are proposing this type of reactor for new construction. We are constructing them. Those reactors can withstand this kind of issues. I mean, they are...
Has it been tested?
Yes, they are ready to withstand a big airplane, commercial airplane like September 11, which would hit this. There would be damage to the walls, certainly, but there would be no release of radioactivity into the atmosphere. This has been taken into consideration. So I think, the risk really of, a terrorist bomb, creating a problem, even a problem, not a problem of explosion, as Gopi was saying, but even a problem of release is not going to happen.
Okay, well, we have to go for another short break. When we come back, once again, let's talk about Asia, in specifically, whether or not Asia can afford not to go down the nuclear path. Stay with us. Thank you for staying with us on Perspectives. Now, just before the break, we were talking about whether or not the new nuclear power plants can withstand terrorist attacks. We didn't quite talk about seismic activity in Asia. Professor Arnold, you come from, you were originally from Belgium, you now live in Asia. When we saw the map earlier, all the pink dots were clustered North America, Europe. Would you be comfortable if tomorrow Indonesia decided to build a nuclear power plant?
Would I be comfortable? I would be comfortable if Indonesia meets two conditions. That is, first of all, that it works very closely together with the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is one of the best UN agencies that exists in terms of governance of nuclear energy in general. And if Indonesia would be open to peer review of its sites, and public peer review, i.e. peer review whereby the reports about the sites are made public and publicly available. Under those two conditions, I don't think you can stop Indonesia from having nuclear reactors. They actually do have 3 today, right? 3 research reactors. And they do have probably 2 uranium mines. I mean, if you would be at the level of the government in Indonesia, you probably look in a very serious way at nuclear energy as an opportunity that you have to take into account. I don't know what the decisions will be. I know that there are intentions at the level of the government in Indonesia to go nuclear with respect to energy provisioning. But as I said, I would really hope that if they do that, that they phase themselves completely within that international network of the International Atomic Energy Agency.
I think I agree with Arno, because in an ideal situation that's what one would like, but in practice it doesn't happen, because nuclear regulation happens to be done by national regulators, and most countries are very touchy about these issues because they equate this with sovereignty. There is hardly any country in the world which opens its nuclear power plant to international peer review, with the possible exception of maybe some European countries. But in most other countries, it's still done by a national regulator. Of course, in an ideal world, we would like the national regulator to open their records to international peer review, which will then generate a lot of goodwill among the public. So in a sense, if you look at public acceptance, these can definitely go a long way in creating a favorable atmosphere for nuclear. But again, if you look at nuclear, public perception is largely a result of skepticism on the part of the public. People wouldn't trust a vendor, people wouldn't trust their national regulator, people wouldn't trust the companies that are building nuclear power plants. They would rather trust people who are ill-informed, because there is a credibility problem there. So these issues can be sorted by having a fair amount of transparency through the regulatory process. And if a regional mechanism or an international mechanism can be in place, but I think it would be an innovation in terms of building new types of institutions that would be required for the future of nuclear power.
Well, the Philippines has shelved its plans to build a plant, yeah? And you seem to imply that you think it can work in areas where there's less seismic activity, you're more confident of the regulation. Do you think Asia is ready for nuclear power?
Certainly Asia is ready. I would think China, India are certainly going ahead with massive expansion plans. Of course, they do have difficulties in terms of public acceptance, but the governments in both these countries are very strong in supporting nuclear growth. In other countries, it's difficult because, especially in Southeast Asia, Indonesia has been talking about nuclear power for a long time, but again, in Indonesia, you see a situation where public is very strongly mobilized against nuclear energy. But my own sense is Vietnam would be the first ASEAN country to build a nuclear power plant.
How can we be sure that the people on the ground in these new plants have had the correct training to not only identify potential problems, but to immediately fix them? How can we know?
Yeah, well, I think you're right. This is very important. I think clearly for a new country to get into nuclear, I mean, you're not getting into nuclear like you're building a shoe factory. Obviously, you have very, very severe constraints that can be imposed. Okay, so those constraints, the first one, of course, are related to safety. You need to go into the safest technology which are available, which will at least protect, against those possible of release terrorists and so forth. You need to have independent safety authorities. I mean, really independent. I think governance is very important. If the authorities are not independent from the operator, then you are creating problems. You are creating actual problem, plus you are creating public acceptance problem. So no, it's not acceptable. So those authorities have to be set up. This is very important. You have safeguards questions, because of course you are handling material, radioactive material somehow, technology which could be proliferating. So you need to have safeguard. But from this perspective, I think most of these countries in Southeast Asia have already adhered to the international framework, and so they are ready for that, to take those commitments in terms of safeguards. And another point also is responsible fuel cycle management. Mm-hmm. You have to think not only of tomorrow's initial plant operation, but what will happen. What will happen with the future, with the waste and everything. This is something that is very important. Again, it's very important by itself, very important for public acceptance. So only under those conditions can you build a reliable program. Then the training helps. You are right. Of course, you need a lot of people need to be trained. You need to bring a force of expertise in those domains.
And not just fresh graduates.
Not just
it's all well and good to get your certificate saying I did nuclear power.
But Elspeth, let's go back in the past. France started a program, in the 70s, and we started from scratch. And at one time we were putting online 5 reactors a year.
Well, you're awfully lucky.
And we did it
well managed.
Not in an earthquake zone.
We trained the people. Yes. So I don't know why it would not be possible in South
The French experience is rather unique, and in fact, many countries could follow that because the French built only one type of reactor and replicated it. So they had expertise in one design, unlike the US or India or other countries like China, which are just proliferating the types of reactors which can create problems in training.
Yes.
When you have a situation where you have 5 or 6 different types of reactors, it constrains the number of people you can train effectively. And the regulation can also be problematic because regulatory authorities usually depend on vendors for technical expertise.
Doesn't give me any comfort.
So that's...
but the point that I would make in there is that Elspeth has, of course, a very important point, that is that it's not only building a plant, but it's creating a whole ecosystem and create the management around it. Yes. But a plant is not built overnight. It is not a shoe factory, as you said, Remy. So it takes probably between the moment that a country starts planning for it and the first reactor online, it probably takes 10 to 15 years. And that gives you the
20
time.
years.
Yeah, well, probably.
Oh, why not solve the problem
in
with
Asia,
gas
things go always a bit faster, right? But I would say that gives you the time to actually build an ecosystem, to start actually training people, give them the experience, send them overseas to learn from it. I think it can be done if you do it as the French did it, as the Belgians did it, as the Koreans did it. It can be done if you take it as a countrywide initiative. And I would actually like to reinforce the point that Gopi made about the French going for one design, because then you get economies of scale and you get learning curves. You go faster. And then maybe you can even get the cost a little bit down.
Okay, maybe the very polite elephant in the room we're not talking about, we're having a very polite conversation, is that in Southeast Asia, there are different systems of government and different levels of governance. Some presidents are there for 2 terms and they're gone, and when things happen, decisions change, operators change. Can we realistically expect in Southeast Asia for countries to have the right levels of governance, management, to be able to guarantee the training and the safety?
There is a famous quote attributed to Alvin Weinberg, who is considered the father of nuclear reactor development. He wrote that one of the conditions for the sustenance of nuclear energy is the longevity of human institutions. Because when you build a reactor today, you're not talking about just its lifetime, because you have to take care of it for 40 years or 60 years through its lifetime. And then you have to deal with the nuclear waste that will have to be sequestered for 10,000 years or even 100,000 years, of course. So you're looking at a problem which will have to be managed, in which human doesn't have experience on that kind of time scale.
Yes.
So you're talking about an extremely sophisticated form of governance and stability, for which Asia is not generally known for. But if it's not impossible, but I'm sure it's going to be a major challenge.
But you haven't answered Deborah's question.
You're too polite.
Well,
hinted at it.
There are some countries where the conditions are there in the human and the institutional stability, and conditions are, let's say, like Singapore, but geographically,
too small, probably.
Geographically, they have constraints.
Yes.
Other countries have geographical convenience, but again, institutional gaps are significant.
No, that's where I would plead that I mean, it's clear that the individual countries may not have those governance systems, but individual countries today work in networks. They work in ASEAN, they work in ASEAN +3, they work in all kinds of relationships with each other. And I do think that nuclear energy in Southeast Asia, as you pointed out, is probably not something that needs to be discussed at the level of one single country. Now, I agree with you, Gopi, with what you said earlier, that countries are very protective of their independence and and see this often as something that they don't want to have controlled by others. But we've learned over the last 20 to 30 years how to work with each other and influence each other. And I think if we could actually look at a framework for governance, and I come back to the International Atomic Energy Agency, which I think has done a great job in a very independent way. If we could involve them more and give them more power and more influence, then I think I would trust to have
You're right.
nuclear energy.
IAEA has done a lot of good work, but their focus and resources seem to be disproportionately in the area of safeguards, not in nuclear safety. But again, it has to do with funding.
Yeah,
because
it has
if
to do with funding.
IAEA has a lot of money on safety,
It's
then
evolving. Thanks, I think Fukushima also, from this perspective, has created, a push for more international review of things, peer reviews, like inside Europe, for instance. We have seen that happening a lot. Japan now is asking for review by IAEA also. So we are seeing this trend. I think it's a good trend that more international standards will be applied to all the countries.
Okay, just stay on that thought. We're going to take another short break. Is it really just about a cost-benefit analysis in the long run? Stay with us. Thank you for staying with us on Perspectives. Now, just before the break, we were talking about the IAEA and international institutions having a role to play in Asia in terms of setting standards. Elspeth, do you think realistically this is something that can be achieved?
I have doubts. From my point of view, living in Singapore for 12 years, watching ASEAN members communicate or not communicate so well together, I am worried. Look at the haze. That happens every year. I'm not sure that the governments are willing to sit down and be completely frank with one another. I'm sorry to be so negative.
Professor, what do you think?
I'm probably more on the optimistic side. I think that nuclear energy also for countries like Indonesia or Vietnam is of such an importance and has such high risks that they will want to have the necessary help. They will want to have the buy-in. They realize that this is not something they can do on their own. And I do think that in the calculations they're going to make, in the end they will prefer to be helped and work together rather than trying to do it all on their own. Maybe I'm too optimistic, but then other countries have ways of pushing, have ways of influencing. It is true, I agree with you, Elsbeth, that on the haze which we suffer from, there is not really a good interaction with each other. But let's face it, the big countries like the United States or China don't get involved in this problem because, well, Beijing has its own problems of haze, right? But if there would be nuclear energy that is generated, is used in Vietnam or Indonesia, I'm sure that the large countries in the world will get involved because they will want to see what's going on. So there are ways of influencing
they can look from outside.
it, yes.
They can look from outside as much as they like.
Yeah.
But the action's on the ground.
in one area.
Are you going to stop Indonesia?
Well, what can I personally do?
Yes.
But there's not, I don't think
I'm
there's
the
much
realist and
dancing on
say
the
it's going to
street
happen. Let's try to influence it the right
celebrating
way.
this.
That's
I think one area where we need to focus is on regional management of nuclear fuel cycle activities. There are at least 40 countries which have expressed interest in nuclear power, and if every country is going to insist on building an enrichment plant or a reprocessing plant, we have a real problem. It doesn't make economic sense for these countries to have them. The best is to have regional consortium building and managing regional fuel cycle facilities. So I think that's one possible option of facilitating regional cooperation. I could think of a regional consortium for Southeast Asia or even Northeast Asia, which handles the enrichment services and reprocessing services if need be. which could be managed in a large country. So again, we are talking about China or possibly Japan or Korea or Indonesia, possibly, which could host such regional facilities. And again, we are completely forgetting Australia, which is a big country where there's plenty of, which can take all of the world's nuclear waste, but still Australians have to be acceptable to that proposal. So I can think, because Australia is producing a good part of the uranium that is consumed around the world, so it makes sense to have waste management facilities in Australia.
There's a lot of space in Kazakhstan too, which is the other uranium producer, right?
Well, we never really talked about the economic sense of nuclear. I mean, we talked about, you know, environmental. We never. Why do governments push so much for nuclear energy now on a cost effectiveness basis? Isn't it very expensive to build a plant, manage the waste?
Well, Deborah, you must already have noticed that I'm probably cautiously in favor of nuclear energy, or electricity based on nuclear energy. But on the other hand, the president of SMU, which is a university for the world of business and management, and who has to think in an economic way, actually has some doubts about the long-term perspectives of nuclear energy, purely on the basis of economics. And Elsbeth already referred to it, that there's actually a major shift happening in the world in terms of oil. The United States probably will become, again, independent and actually a net exporter, thanks to shale oil. The West as a whole will become far less independent on the Middle East for its oil than it used to be. Europe is still very much dependent on Russia for gas.
And Japan.
And one should not forget that nuclear energy, to some extent, it is expensive. And thus, in comparison with gas or coal, it is actually not as economic and has more risks, as Elsbeth pointed out. But it provides higher energy security for many countries. And that's the reason why I think that quite a few
energy security, well, because you manage the supply.
You manage the supply of your energy in a much better way.
Yeah, you can have 10 years worth fuel requirement on the reactor site if you want. So that's one huge advantage.
Remy, you want to jump in?
I disagree on the economics. I think that, of course, people are focusing on the investment side. It's clear that, you know, if you build a gas plant, you know, you can have it for rather cheap price
How much
initially.
Is it cost to build a nuclear power plant?
Nuclear power plants are in a question of billions of
He doesn't know
euro.
because they're still trying to build one in Finland that keeps on running over budget and over time.
But we are building two in China which are not at all overrunning their cost. So we know the cost pretty well. But the costs are high at the beginning. It's clearly there is a big investment at the beginning. But then operating costs, of course, are very different. They are stable and they are predictable. And over the long run, it's a fact. It's a fact of history that it has been cheaper. You look at Korea. I mean, Korea, you look at the figures in Korea. I mean, the figures for nuclear power, electricity generated by nuclear power in Korea is about $35, $40 per megawatt.
Is not being attached to the wastes.
No,
we're
everything
just
is catched.
pushing them under the carpet. We're not attaching any.
No, everything is
included.
everything is included.
You don't take into account the unpredictabilities, because if you look at the MIT study of a few years ago, it was clear that the kilowatt costs you 8.8 cents or something like that for nuclear, and 7 cents around 7 cents for coal and gas. It's because of the unpredictability. And you know I'm defending nuclear energy.
But unpredictability, I think, is in the gas,
right?
And in the oil and coal. I mean, can you tell me, if an operator builds a nuclear plant today, they can know exactly how much it's going to cost them in terms of fuel for the next 15, 20 years. Can you tell me what the coal price will be in 20 years? Can you tell me what the oil price will be in 20 years? Nobody can. But everybody expects that it will be more expensive. So I think in terms of predictability, it's clear. And in terms of global cost, again, look again at the French case of Korea. When you look at those countries which have decided to have a significant share of electricity from nuclear, the price of electricity is one of the lowest of the continent. This is the case in France. Electricity is half the price as the rest of Europe, and this is the case.
Let's not go in that debate, because that is As a consumer in France, I didn't feel that low price, right?
But also
the
on the
industry
cost
pays a
of
little
the
bit less.
Yeah. The cost we need to focus on two different aspects. One is the front-loaded cost or the overnight cost. This is where nuclear compares very unfavorably. But if you look at the long run, as Remy pointed out, depending on the assumptions that you're making about the returns and also the carbon price that you're willing to pay, so then nuclear could be competitive or not competitive. So there are a lot of uncertainties on the cost because of the absence of global warming agreement in the future. And most of the nuclear advocates would insist that we need a carbon tax in order to make nuclear power competitive in the long run.
Yeah, right? Because it's true, because, you know, a lot of people say, okay, you are not taking into consideration about, you know, the future dismantling, which is not true, because it is actually taken into consideration in the cost of nuclear. There is provision reserves.
How can we take into consideration 500 years from now?
Well, it is done. You know, I mean, it's part of the calculation. But in the case of the carbon creating, the CO2 producing energies, you know, we are not taking this into consideration. What is the real cost of CO2 in the future? I mean, it's just something that is left for our children. And I don't think this is the right way.
Thank you very much. And on that note, thank you all of you for joining us today. Why should you and I care about nuclear energy in Asia? Because the truth is that as Asia continues to grow, consume and buy more, it will need energy, and fossil fuels are currently a finite source. Nuclear energy is one of the options, and if we don't want to consider nuclear, then we might also have to consider cutting back and progressing slower. We hope you've found tonight's discussion on nuclear power thought-provoking. Remember, you are important to us. Do help us shape the next episode of Perspectives. Keep writing and connecting with us by leaving your comments on our website, channelnewsasia.com/perspectives, and you can tweet us as well. Till our next edition of Perspectives, join us again on the 30th of September. Thank you. Good night. Thank you all. It was quite an illuminating discussion. I found it.
Many things we could have talked about.